time we saw how Cain was rejecting the temple presence of God by choice. Oh. Yeah, so last time we saw how Cain was rejecting the temple presence of God by choice. He was the first atheist, if you guys remember. Cain was the first atheist. We learned that God does not judge by the things that we truly don't know. This is different than rejecting that which we know to be true. And this is why we'll learn later, if you're incapable of understanding God at a certain point in your life, for instance, if you're a baby, right, then you're not judged based on things you don't know. That's not how God works. But God does not judge by the things, but this is different than rejecting God because we know something to be true. What are we talking about here? All sinners know God as God because God reveals himself by creation. So God reveals himself by creation. We learn that everything in creation is called God's general revelation because God generally reveals himself. This is all back in Genesis 1. The knowledge of God is inserted into us. That's how every sinner knows God. And that's how every person becomes self-aware as God's image. It's because God implants his knowledge into the person. He inserts it. It's by God's knowledge that we become self-aware. When we become aware of another mind, that's when we become aware of ourselves. We become aware, we become self-aware because God is self-aware, and we are made in God's image. And so from last week, if you guys remember, marriage with physical siblings represented the first union with Adam, which has been broken by Adam's sin, that union. Now marriage represents the union of the Messiah of God, the second firstborn, which is of a spiritual nature. Therefore, we are commanded to marry within our spiritual family now, which will be called the tribes of OT. And in New Testament, they're going to be called Christians. We'll talk about more on that later, but that's the reason why at this point in time, because God has not revealed that the union with the Messiah is a different nature, he's allowing siblings to marry at this point. Okay, so verse 20, right? Ada bore Jabal, he was the father of those who dwelt in tents and of livestock. What does that sound like? This is like Old Testament language, but think about if somebody said somebody made buildings and was able to grow crops. What does that sound like? These guys were good at, what were they good at if they're building buildings? Yeah, architecture, right? They excelled at architecture. What if somebody were good at tending to livestock, having lots of animals? What are they good at? Farming or agriculture, right? His brother's name was Jabal. He was the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe. Right? So if somebody was like, hey, this guy is awesome at playing the saxophone and trumpet, what would you call this guy? A musician, yeah. These guys are excelling at architecture, livestock, and music. Right? But there's more. Next verse. Zillah also bore Tubal Cain, and he was the forger of all instruments of bronze and iron. So if somebody was like, these guys are excelling at making stuff with iron and copper and, bronze, stainless steel, well, what would you call these guys? Blacksmiths. They excel at metalwork. What's going on here? Because remember, this is Cain's line. What's going on? The sister of Tubal Cain was Nama. You know what Nama means? It means pretty. So not only do they excel at all these material things, but what else are they excelling at? Beauty. This is Cain's line. And then, Lamech said to his eyes, etc., etc. We'll talk about that later. What's going on here? This is Cain's genealogy. And the question that we as readers, so if you've been reading from Genesis 1 to all the way up to here, you're like, why is God allowing Cain's line to prosper as such? Right? Cain rejected God by choice. He rejected the temple presence of God. He left the temple presence of God by choice. Why does God even care what Cain's family is up to? Didn't Cain leave God? So Genesis is about the seed forms of things. How did things begin, and how do we get here where we are right now? We're going to learn later that God has much interest in all nations, not just his own people, but his people in context of all nations. And it's God's will that Gentile nations join Israel's blessing in God's covenant. Israel will be God's firstborn in the Old Testament. I mean, the New Testament, well, but under Jesus Christ. But the nation of Israel will be God's firstborn. And the firstborn blessing of Israel, God's intent, is to have that firstborn blessing be shared with other nations. We'll talk about this way later, though, when we actually get to Moses. Actually, when we get to Abraham. Actually, when we get to Noah, but only partially for Noah. Suffice to say now, God takes interest in Cain, the rebellious family. That's the point. God is taking note of what's going on in Cain's family. So what should we notice? This passage is in contrast to the next section, which is Cain's younger brother Seth's family line from Genesis 4:25 into chapter 25. Let's read that. And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another offspring instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. So Cain is the replacement. It's another appointment, right? Seth's name, we're going to talk about this later, but Seth's name literally means like appointed, or like appointed again, like a replacement. Next verse. To Seth also a son was born, and he was called Enosh. At that time, the people began to call upon the name of the Lord. That's going to be significant later, but we're not going to get to it today. We're going to get to it next week. This is the book of generations of Adam. When God created man, he created him in the likeness of God, male and female. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Adam that were lived were 930 years, and he died. So Adam died. So we're talking about Seth's line now. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days were Seth for 912 years, and he died. What's going on here? When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. Do you guys see a pattern in Seth's line here? That's in contrast to Cain's line. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus, all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. Guess what's going to happen to his son? Yeah, he's going to die. What about the next son? Die. Next son, die. This is in contrast with Cain's family. Cain's family is like, excelling in all these arts, blacksmith, metalwork, craft, right? Architecture, even beauty. Cain's family would what we would call like the Maxims and the, Vogues or whatever the beauty standards are of his day. What's going on here? Cain's line is described to be civilization builders. Those who understand architecture and so if you remember, when it's talking about tents, it's not talking about cloth tents or like the plastic tents that's not what it's talking about when it says tents. It's talking about people where place live in, dwelling places. So people might say, what gives? Why does God allow Cain's line to be civilization builders while Seth's line is marked by their deaths? Well, where is Seth living? Near God, right? And then Cain's family is living away from God. In fact, he built an entire atheist city called Enoch away from God's presence. So there's too much going on here to chase every rabbit hole here. So again, we're going to have to skip over a lot of things and then return to them when the seed forms of these Genesis ideas come back a little bit later. So when we say what's going on here, right, we can summarize this to a broader question. Why does God allow evil men to prosper? Why does God allow evil men to prosper? There are several reasons, but our focus is going to be on two. The first is God demonstrates his grace and mercy on sinners. That's why God allows evil men to prosper, because it demonstrates his mercy on sinners. Mercy and grace. And we're going to talk about this later. It's called common grace, but we'll talk about that later. And the second reason, evil men who prosper in this life have too much evidence of their rebellion against God if they die in their sin. So when evil men die in their sin, they have no excuse before God if they prospered on this earth. We would say here, and we want to insert more here because people would say, well, what if evil men don't prosper on this earth? Well, they still have enough evidence. But the fact that evil men prosper, that makes them more accountable because we'll get to that right now. So we're going to address the first part, which is God's grace and mercy towards sinners. In the Reformed tradition, that's us because we are in the Reformed Church of America denomination. So we're Reformed here. In the Reformed tradition, we identify two kinds of grace of God. One is called common grace, and the other one is called particular grace or saving grace. We are saved by saving grace, but Common grace is given to all mankind. So back to Genesis 1, and this is very important. God is the creator and we are the creatures. Given Genesis 1's 10 words, in the beginning God created the heaven and the earth, the necessary conclusion that any reasoning creature must draw is that the creator is such because God is not dependent on anything besides himself. And this is just a review of Genesis 1. God is not dependent on anything outside of God's self. On the other hand, everything made by God is dependent on God to be. And here's, for a more detailed and thorough proof and explanation of this, refer back to the June and July sermons if they are still up. If they're not up, refer to your notes at that time. And if you don't have those notes either, sometime in next year's Bible study, you can bring it up as a topic that we can discuss. And I'll be more than happy to go into details about Genesis 1. So you can bring it up as a topic later, because we don't have time to go into it right now. It took 8 weeks to lay that foundation down, so we don't have time. Okay. So back to topic. Because these are necessary conclusions that God is absolutely independent and creatures are in their being, in essence, totally dependent on God to be who and what they are. Right? So that's the foundation we need to remember before we move on. If there is any goodness we as God's creatures receive from God, it is not something innate in us that causes God to give something to us. You guys understand? It's not because we did something toward God that God says, oh, now I see something innate within you. Now I see something inside of you, and that's why I'm going. That's not what happens. God freely gives based on his voluntary condescension. In fact, God gives to us, when we're talking about God's grace especially, things that we don't deserve, and we're talking about common grace now, which also later on we're going to talk about particular grace, but God's not influenced by the creature to give to the creature. God is not influenced by the creature. He's only influenced by his own voluntary condescension and self-will. So to confess this reality as a tenet of the Reformed faith, so to have people agree that this is what's going on. In the 1647 Westminster Standards, also known as Westminster Confession of Faith, in Chapter 7, Article 1, this is how that reality is expressed. The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures do owe obedience unto him as their creator, yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward, but by some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he has been pleased to express by way of covenant. So God's grace, which is expressed by God in the context of a relation called the covenant, comes to us only by some voluntary condescension on God's part. Do you guys know what condescension means? Condescension is like, let's say a third grader wants to talk to me, right? But they're not going to understand what I'm talking about unless I use their language. And I sort of stoop down to their level and talk in the words and in the vocabulary and in their the concepts that they think in. So I have to sort of like lower myself to the third grader. When we're talking about God, it's more like a father lowering himself to a baby and, lisping with the baby, all that goo goo gaga stuff, so that the baby understands like, oh, the father's trying to communicate with us. Does that make sense? That's condescension, lowering himself in order to meet us where we are. So God's grace, that God's grace, right? Whatever God gives us that we don't deserve, and it's common to all men, we'll talk about that, but that grace is given to us only by God's voluntary. So he doesn't have to, but he chose to come down to our level. His voluntary condescension by his self-will. Common grace is called common grace because it pleased God to give a general benefit, a general goodness in Adam. So if you're born in Adam, there is a general goodness that God gives to all mankind through and in Adam. And it is by that God's common grace that before sin entered the world, Adam and those in Adam were able to express God's goodness, holiness, and righteousness. So remember how we said Adam and Eve were created in God's original righteousness, original holiness, and original knowledge of God? And therefore, their tendency originally before sin was to give worship to God and do all the things that God commanded of them, and they did it gladly. The reason why they were able to do that is because God, by God's common grace, He gave them that kind of a tendency because they don't deserve it. It's not like they had something within themselves that God said, you deserve this. God freely and voluntarily condescended and said, you guys have this so that you have this tendency to follow me. So it's not because Adam had any worth, but it pleased God to give worth to Adam in order to reflect God's glory. That's what's going on, and that's common grace. It's common because that glory, that ability to have this tendency to move towards God is given to all mankind in Adam before Adam sinned. And this is in contrast with the Roman Catholic view, because we're Reformed. The Roman Catholic view has a different view of God's grace. And because of that, we have no common grounds with the Roman Catholic view of grace, because they believe in this thing called prevenient grace and something else, supernatural grace. And we'll get to this either probably in the Bible study, but their formulation of grace doesn't allow for what God is talking about in Cain's point here. Why do evil men prosper? We'll talk about that way later, though. So for now, suffice to say, God's glory is expressed in this world because God's goodness still extend to those that not only did not deserve it, but deserve the opposite, nothing less than wrath. So God's common grace, so after Adam sinned, God's common grace still extended to Adam, even though now Adam deserves nothing but wrath. Does that make sense? That's why Adam wasn't consumed immediately, because the common grace of God is holding back, and we're going to talk about this later when we get to probably when we get to Moses or even Noah. God's grace is what's holding God's wrath back. God's grace is what holds God's wrath back on individuals. So even after Adam sinned, the fact that Adam was not immediately consumed, that's the common grace of God working in that in Adam, towards Eve. And for particular grace, we're going to get to that when we get to Noah. Or if it's too dense for a sermon, because particular grace is it's a very dense topic. If it's too dense, maybe a future Bible study. Maybe we can touch on it and then talk about it in a Bible study. But that's the first reason. So God is trying to show mercy and grace towards sinners. That's why evil men prosper. He's saying, here's an opportunity for you to turn back. Right? God doesn't say you don't even have an opportunity. That's not who God is. God says, here's an opportunity for you. That's God's common grace. So He's suppressing the sins of the sinner. He's suppressing their sin so they can see sin for what it is, and they can see God for who He is, and then God's grace for what it is, which the sinner can reject, which is what Cain and the rest of the Enoch city did. So that's the first reason. The second reason is, why does God allow evil men to prosper? Is that evil men have no excuse when faced with God's judgment. In fact, nobody has an excuse, because everything in creation is revealed by God, and it reveals God's order. But it's more so for evil men who prosper. In this world, anything can be called prosperity, and prosperity happens. Anything that can be called prosperity that happens, it's because by God's grace. You can only prosper if God's been graceful to you. If God's given grace to you, that's the only way you can prosper. And the reason for that is, everything in creation has an order. Everything in creation has an order. Everything in creation was made by God's word in this world, and it's going to stand until this heaven, or that exists now, and this earth passes away. That order of God that God created from the beginning is going to stand until it passes away into the second heaven, the second earth. We're talking about that way later, back towards Revelation. So when evil men prosper, it's because they were able to see some kind of order in the world that they live in. That's why they prosper. Because some men see order in the world that they live in. What are we talking about here? Anytime evil men prosper, they are confessing to God that they understand the order by which they prospered. the order which God set into creation from the beginning. They're confessing to God, we recognize His order when they prosper. So when you see wealthy men, you got to go, well, how did they get wealthy? Well, by this order called economics. And there's an order there, which is why they're able to manipulate or see the order and then play into that order. Production by labor produces wealth. That simple phrase is an economic law. You learn at any economic class anywhere in the world. Production by labor produces wealth. The fact that sinners prosper using God's order means they understand how to manipulate that order to prosper. Right? So evil men who prosper, they understand that there's an order to economics. They know that there's an order. And as we talked about before, behind an order, there's a pattern. And behind a pattern, there's a mind. And the thing is, we even saw how our minds are even, we developed to intuit this. So it's not like somebody has to tell us, hey, there's a mind behind a pattern. We grow up intuiting there's a mind behind order and patterns. So then God's question is, if you as a sinner understand the order of creation in that area that allowed you to prosper as a sinner, if you understand that order, then why don't you as a sinner understand the disorder of the heart when you deny all the things, when you deny that all things must be created, and that behind that creation is an order, and behind that order is a mind, especially the Creator's mind. Especially not recognizing or giving thanks to the Creator who made you prosper. Right? So if there's an order, there's a mind behind the order. If you prospered because of that order, doesn't it make sense you should give thanks to the person that allowed that order to be there? So what are you talking about? Well, let's say you go downstairs to the cafeteria and there's food there. The first thing behind, when we see the food on the cafeteria table, the first thing in your mind isn't that food just came out of nowhere. We intuit somebody placed the food there so we can eat it. Right? So then the natural tendency for us should be, well, we should thank the people that put the food down there for us. Does that make sense? We should thank them. That's what's going on here. If they prosper due to an order, they should recognize, well, that order's there because of a mind behind that order. But when they prosper, they don't bother thanking the person that put that order there, which is God. And God is saying, that's the catch. That's why the sinner is rejecting, right? So they see the order around them, but then when it comes to their own hearts, they reject order. And that's why they are sinners. Or not that's why they're sinners, but because they're sinners, that's their tendency. So you guys understand that part about prospering? When evil men prosper? Well, some people might say, what if a person won the lottery by chance? How is that order? Well, let me ask you guys a question. What rule is there that says if you win the lottery, you must get money? Where is that rule written? So let's say I won the Powerball. How much is it now? Like $200 million? Let's say I won that. I got the lottery ticket right. What rule is there where I say if I show it to the person and say, hey, I got the lottery number right, what rule enforces the fact that I should get that money now? Yeah, there is no rule, right? It's just based on a social contract. Social contract and a moral order. Because the people who run that organization go, well, we have this contract that says whoever wins the lottery number, they should get the money. Right? Where did that order come from? Because they might as well just say, oh, I know we promised you to give the money, but we'll just keep the money. Right? They can say that if they want to, but what's preventing them from doing that? You might say they might get arrested. Well, why should they get arrested? What kind of social order and a moral order behind, what social and moral order is there that causes these people to go, but we might get arrested? Why don't the people that arrest them go, oh, well, we'll just not arrest them? Right? So you see that the system itself has an order, and the question is, where did that order come from? Things don't come out of nowhere. You can't have spontaneous order coming out of nowhere. Whenever you're talking about order, we're talking about something that somebody already has and that's delegated or derived into or towards something. So, of course, here we're Christians and we go, okay, that order is, of course, that social and moral contract, that order is from God and it's delegated to human beings. That's why that social order is there. That's why if you win the lottery, you get to keep it. And then some people might go, hey, what if you prosper by cheating, stealing, and murdering? What if you prosper by cheating, stealing, and murdering and hide all that in your laptop? Well, you can only cheat, steal, and murder when you undermine a social and moral order that's already in place. Right? Isn't the definition of cheating going through the holes of whatever is already there, bypassing the rules? By definition, cheating implies that there's some sort of order there. Same with stealing. You can only cheat, steal, and murder when you undermine a social and moral order that's already in place. And again, we ask, where did that social and moral order come from? And here's where we as sinners are accountable for this. Every person made in God's image recognizes this order, because as God's image, every person recognizes God is the creator and they are the creature. Every image of God recognizes this. The problem is the sinner rejects this truth of God and decide that they themselves are the owners of their body and spirit. So James chapter 4, verse 1 says, where do these wars and fightings come from among you? Do they not come from there, even from the lust that war in your heart? You lust and you have not. You kill and you desire to have, and you cannot obtain. You fight and you war, and yet you have not because you do not ask, or because you ask not. You ask and receive not because you ask amiss, that you may consume it upon your lust. Ye adulterers and adulteresses, know you not that the friendship of the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever will be a friend of the world is the enemy of God. So enemy of God here, this is in James chapter 4, verses 1 through 4, meaning a rebeller or sinner that goes against God's order, against God's logos. That's the enemy of God. If you go against God's logos, you're an enemy of God. The sinner who indulges his heart's desires, the lust of his heart, is by definition anti-logos, a revolutionary. Someone who always has the tendency to flip God's logos upside down. Someone who has a tendency to always undermine God's order. Even though they understand God's order is the simplest things, such as breathing in air, drinking when thirsty, eating when hungry, and so on. And to bring all this back to Cain's passage about prospering, Cain and his atheist city has no excuse before God when God sends Noah's flood to warn, or when God sends Noah to warn them. So God will send Noah to warn about this judgment of God coming, and Cain and his city, Cain's probably dead by then, but the city of Cain has no excuse because they prospered. Because they themselves understand God's order through metalwork, music, architecture, beauty, etc. No sinner has an excuse before God because they understand the creation order when it comes to their profit and benefit, but deny God when it comes to their desire to indulge their sin. Even something as simple as eating something without thanking God who had made it possible to eat that meal, even though they see the rest of the animal kingdom being provided for in the college of God's creatures. And we're 4 minutes over, but any questions? In that case, let's pray, take offering, and then finish worship by benediction.